this week's episode, I am joined by the amazing Paul Williams, who is an experienced QHHT therapist. Now, QHHT, for those of you who aren't aware, is Quantum Healing Hypnosis Technique, which was developed by Dolores Cannon. Now, if this is your first introduction to Dolores Cannon, you're in for a treat as we discuss some of her works and how she developed this technique and what she achieved. However, if you're already familiar with her work, there is still a lot to be gained in this episode as we elaborate on some of the work that she did do and really give you some food for thought. I hope that you enjoy this episode. Welcome to this week's episode of The Happy Psychic, and this week I am joined by Paul Williams, who is hypnotherapist, a transformational teacher and an energy healer. And Paul, you are a massive fan of Dolores Cannon and her works, and you're also a QHHT practitioner yourself. So it's very, very good to have you. Welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me on.
I'm so excited about this conversation. I have read so many of Dolores Cannon's books, and I probably haven't read all of her work, but I have read a lot of it. I've watched a lot of it on YouTube when, she's doing her talking and her teaching, and I find just the whole topic really fascinating. But tell us a little bit, for those of, the listeners that haven't actually come across this before, what is QHHT?
Well, great question to begin with. So QHHT is Quantum Healing Hypnosis Technique, and it was a technique of hypnosis developed by Dolores Cannon herself over a period of about 45 years. Now, she refined this method through practice and trial and error, and as she began to work with what she called the subconscious, or SC abbreviated, she began to experience some, let's say, strange things occurring. And she would always say that, a lot of, particularly psychiatrists, would be afraid to go to the deeper levels that she tended to work in. But this exploration for her was where she really derived some of this profound material, particularly that you read about, as you said, you've read her books. So for the audience, her books are based on all of her regression work sessions. And so they are, they're very interesting, everything from the Convoluted Universe series to conversations with Nostradamus, getting information from his many quatrains that were certainly the conversation that they had together. He felt that they had not been interpreted correctly, and so that they worked together to interpret those quatrains for modern times. And that's where we're left with that series.
Yeah, because she actually stumbled upon it by accident, though, didn't she? Whenever she came across this work, I can't remember exactly how, but my vague recollection is that she was doing a regression with somebody, and something just happened, and this just somebody else came through. Am I right in my remembering of that?
Yeah, well, you've struck right on it. So, years ago, and it's described in her book, I believe it's Between Death and Life. And she was, along with Johnny, her husband, way back years ago, before reincarnation had really been widespread in what we would call the awakening community. I steer away from the word new age often because I don't personally like that word, but I say the awakening community or the conscious community. And back then, it really wasn't a subject that was discussed at all. In fact, Dolores Cannon, when she tried to publish her books years ago, was rejected many, many times. So back then, she decided to self-publish for that reason. But back in that book, Between Death and Life, she talks about this in detail. Her and Johnny, her husband, were just doing a typical regression for, bad habits, stop smoking, overeating, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And this woman spontaneously went into a past life And she went so deeply that she became this other person. She had many of the characteristics of the accent. I've seen this a number of times myself in my work, where the individual will go so deeply into that life, they will literally become that person and take on the attributes of that other person. And so it surprised them, probably freaked them out a little bit in the beginning, but it caused great intrigue with Dolores. And strange enough, she would take that turn to go down that path to what is known as QHHT today. But as I said earlier, 45 years plus actually of development and refining that method.
I find some of her work fascinating. Now, whenever I look at my own journey, you talk about the awakening community, and I think that it's really important for people to be aware that whenever we're on our journey of awakening and we're starting to become a bit more of a bit more aware of the world that we're living in, and some of these practices like Dolores Cannon and things like, there's so much out there now. However, whenever I was at the beginning of my journey, there was a book by Dolores that I had read, and I found it a bit far-fetched. The information, and she does sort of talk about that herself, like, I don't want to give you too much information because it's going to go over your head. I don't know if you're ready for it. And at the time, I can remember just thinking to myself, there's so much of her stuff resonates with me, but this just seems a bit far-fetched. And actually what I have found is that as I have moved further along my path and my consciousness has expanded, it has just seemed less and less far-fetched. And I think that it's important for people to remember that with things like this. If this is the first time that somebody is coming to Dolores Cannon, that, some of her work and some of her teachings might seem, a little bit out there for you right now. But then once you come along your journey a little bit, perhaps a lot more of it will resonate with you. One of the things in particular, actually, whenever I think back to the Nostradamus books, so there was a couple of things that Dolores actually talked about whenever she was writing her Nostradamus books. And one of them was, there was this idea that she was interpreting the quatrains from Nostradamus, that whenever she was connecting to him through these various people, that actually she was helping him interpret them in order to bring them to the world and to bring the accurate depictions through. However, she did throw this sort of thought in there that actually, was she helping him interpret them, or was she helping him write them? And
well,
that's
that
what
is
I
a
actually
very interesting question. And, I'll sort of touch on what you said earlier. I always give this analogy for people to understand. It's kind of like we're familiar with the schooling system. You start over in the UK and Ireland. I thought they know it as first grade, and then they progress onwards. And can you imagine, and this is easy for people to see, going into intellectual discussions with high school kids and primary school kids? They're just not going to get it. It's going to intellectually go over their understanding. And so that is how it is with some of these more convoluted spiritual concepts. When we first start our spiritual journey, we progress up the grades, and as we're evolving our consciousness, we kind of seek out more and more ways of understanding reality. And I would say someone that finds themselves like yourself reading her books, you're kind of at an advanced stage. So it's interesting now that you say that you get it more now because how you've advanced as a soul. But great question regarding Nostradamus and Dolores. And I actually think that because time, and she defined this many times in her work, it's very hard for people to get hold of this concept. It's a little bit strange for a lot of people that time is existing at the same time, not in a lineal sense, more of that it's happening all in the now moment, and that we're tuned in. Another great analogy is think of a radio or a TV. all of the other channels exist at the same time, but you will flick between channel to channel because you're tuned into that particular program. Now, you've got other movies playing on other channels, other live shows, programs playing on the other channels. They're all playing out at the same time, but you can only focus on one at a time as you flick the channel. And so that is kind of how time exists. I believe there was a connection between the two of them through what we would call, or out of time, where they were able to work in conjunction with each other. So was she able to affect him in his time period? I think so. I don't know if we'll ever know the full extent of that, but we certainly knew. And I'll give you a bit of insight into actually what Nostradamus was described to be doing. Have you heard of a black mirror before?
Yeah. The only reason I know it is from the Nostradamus books. That's the only reason that I have heard of a black mirror.
Yeah.
Can you explain to us what that is, just so the listeners can understand that a bit better?
Exactly. Well, we're in France in his time that he lived. There was known to be what people would call magical devices, and a black mirror was one of these things. He gave people the ability to go into it and to be able to, I would say, get information or see things. So all of the things that he would see would be in through the portal of that mirror. It acts as a portal. In fact, that is kind of what it is. So it was a portal where he was getting information. So he would go into that or look into it however he was doing it. I think he would go into almost a meditative space. And through that device, he was able to access and communicate with, it was Dolores Cannon, through her subject under hypnosis, who had a past life as a assistant working with Nostradamus. So that's how it came about. And so I believe this was a female lady in this time, and it was a young male at the time of Nostradamus. I believe I've got that right. Maybe fact check me on that, but I think that is right. And was able to connect with him and get this information. So really fascinating stuff. May go over a lot of people's heads. That's okay. And once again, I think it's so important to note with any kind of work, and even for people that interpret things like the Bible, you can have so many interpretations really of the same information. People will see it differently. And I know people do this with Dolores Cannon's work, and I don't think it really matters how it's interpreted. I mean, one person is going to have their own understanding of it, and I think such is life, that you can interpret any way you want.
Yeah. One of the things, actually, when you talk about the black mirror, because I don't know, I don't have a concept of what that is in the real world. I haven't ever seen one before. I haven't ever used one, but I really wonder whether it's the same concept as crystal ball gazing or tarot card reader, or somebody using, it's a device that helps us connect. And the reason that I wonder that is, as a psychic medium, whenever I was coming along my path, I used cards. That was really how I helped my connection. Now I can do a reading. I can just connect instantly, and I can just talk. I might look as if I'm looking off somewhere in the distance, but the information just comes. However, I had to almost train myself by using the cards in order to get to that, because what the cards gave me was like a focal point that helped me sort of get into that meditative trance-like state while I was awake and let the information flow. So I wouldn't look at a card and think, oh, that card means, that, because I can remember learning that in a book. It was more that I would have looked at a card and all of a sudden I would have softened my gaze, and it just sort of drew me into something, and all of a sudden I used to get the images coming in my mind. The clairvoyance would kick in. So to me, it sounds very, very similar in that regard. And it's hard because without being there, we won't really know for sure. But it does sound as though that was what he was doing. Like he was a seer, he was a clairvoyant, and that was just his tool of choice, really.
Totally agree with what you're saying, and I've had a similar experience. You do start out in this work of working with people and tapping into this universal consciousness. And when you start, you often will use cards. And as you progress and you become more skillful, you trust your abilities more, then you rely on those things less and less. And so absolutely, there are so many different things like crystal balls and black mirrors and tarot cards and Ouija boards even. I know that has been the start of many people's journey. And someone I know actually developed their own sort of version of getting information through even objects like crystals. So it doesn't kind of matter what doorway we go in. These are just ways of us to connect with really what it is I call it the highest self. And this is some people call it the higher self, or the psychiatrists like to refer it to as the right side of the right hemisphere of the brain. But we all have this higher aspect of our consciousness as what we call individual self. And so really it's tapping into that is connected to this universal field. You might call it the quantum field. And I think great people that are in sort of research like Dr. Joe Dispenza are talking about this quantum field from a scientific and medical point of view. So there are so many different ways of getting into, and hypnosis is another great way of getting in touch with the higher self. Meditation is another great doorway. So you can think of these things as doorways to access this dimension, let's call it.
Yeah, that's actually a great way to think of it. And you know what? I feel a bit embarrassed at the fact that I'm sitting here now today thinking, I hadn't really thought of hypnosis just being another way to get to the information that I perhaps get to with my clairvoyance, for example. I can travel back to different times. I can travel back to different incarnations, and what I might see is an interpretation of what was happening at that time or what is happening at that particular point in the timeline. And I have went into the future as well, but it just happens that I don't need to have the hypnosis aspect in order to do that. Now, there's a really interesting thing here, and I want to touch on something else that happened within the Nostradamus books that Dolores talked about. There was a time. Now, whenever she would have regressed somebody, I have so many questions. I'll try and keep it.
Great.
I'll try and keep on the one track because otherwise we'll go all over the place. But there was a point in time where we went back. She regressed her person. I know she'd went through a couple of different people at times, depending on their availability, but she had regressed this person and they had went back. And I believe that Nostradamus was older in age. And I think he was having a heart attack or something like that. And actually, the person that was in the mirror, I think, I don't know if that's the right terminology, but it's almost like the person that they had connected to in that time, or the person that was in the mirror, was able to do something in order to ring a bell to alert somebody that he needed help, which I find fascinating because I have never been able to do that. I've never been able to impact on anything whenever I have been having my visions. I'm able to get the information, but I'm not able to interfere in some way. Yeah. So I find that aspect fascinating. And I don't know if that is because of the way it's done, or I don't know. I don't know if I maybe have the potential to do that.
Is it telekinesis is the ability, I think, to be able to affect objects with the consciousness. Is it
Yeah.
telekinesis? I believe it is. So that's
Bending
what.
spoons and things like that. Yeah.
Exactly. So this is sort of something, and look, I haven't been able to do that personally either. That's not something I've accessed yet. Although we all have access to these, I call our inherent psychic abilities, but I think we're born with. However, like a lot of things, it lies dormant within the individual, waiting to be awakened, and then for that individual to practice. And you're a perfect example of this, because you've refined this skill. You've practiced and practiced through repetition and experience and trial and error, and you've got to the place where you're professionally, offering your services. Now, it would be like a singer, right? I like this analogy as well. We all have the ability to sing. We have a set of lungs. We have a vocal cords. We can sing. Now, some will interpret they've been great singers, that maybe we're not good. A lot of people, family members, will tell us we can't sing. However, we still have that ability. And yet there are those that become so skillful at that through practice and dedication. I think of someone that has achieved an opera career, and the training of the dialect and so on that goes into that training. They become very skillful, but we all have this ability.
Yeah. Sorry, excuse me. So it's just really tapping into it. One of the things that I find fascinating as well is dreams. So I get a lot in my dream state, and some of it really does feel like I'm out of my body, traveling all over and experiencing things. And there was a dream that I had recently, and it feels very, very relevant. And I'm going to explain why. But I had a dream recently where I was sitting around a table with, a couple of different women. We were from a part of England somewhere, and they were talking about something in the news at that particular time. And there was a newspaper that was sat on the table, and they were talking about Little Britain, which is a show. It's a
Yes.
TV show that was on years ago. Now, I don't really know much about that show. I can remember watching it, but if you were to have asked me when that was from, I wouldn't have known. But in my dream, this was being talked about, like it was, oh, did you watch the new episode last night? So it was happening at that particular time. And there was a newspaper sat on the table, and I wanted to pick that newspaper up because I wanted to check the date. So this was me in my dream state, but I couldn't pick the newspaper up. And I asked one of the ladies that I was with, I was like, oh, my memory's so bad. I think we were all older. And I can remember saying in my dream, like, oh, my memory's so bad. Like, what year is it? What year are we in? And then she said 2003. Right. And I have very, very vivid dreams, and I write them down. And in my dream, I even realized, it's almost like my dream state realized this is another life. You're in another life right now. Which whenever I woke up the next day, the first thing I did was I Googled when was Little Britain on TV. And it was 2003. So I was a bit like, oh my God, that's amazing. So that made me fascinated, because I was like, okay, so we have multiple lives. I always think of the soul as a collection of the different lives and incarnations that we have. So that the soul is like the nucleus, I guess, of all of that. And then we have the spirit of each incarnation that exists, that is a part of the soul. So to me, that was making me realize, and I had a conversation with my spirit guide after that, because I was so eager to find out a little bit more about this. But what it actually meant was that we could have multiple incarnations happening from that one soul at a particular time. But as each one draws to a close and finishes, we strengthen. So it's like the energy is spread amongst whatever is left, and then we strengthen, which then gives us more inherent gifts and abilities and ability to access all of these different gifts. And that was mind-blowing to be able to get that information. And that has only just happened recently, but it really just, the fact that in Nostradamus, that Dolores was able to regress somebody, and all of a sudden, Nostradamus is, crippled on the floor and couldn't breathe, clutching his chest, and they were able to intervene and ring a bell. And
Yeah.
yet I couldn't pick that paper up. I tried, and I felt like I just couldn't pick it up. And I was desperate to know what the date was, because I wanted to validate when it was, so I could know that something was happening.
Yeah, incredible that. And what I love about this whole area, it's almost like a time travel machine when we learn this, because we can go into the future, we can go into the past, we can, and I've done this with clients. I had a client that jumped to 2043, and I was able to ask a number of questions about life in the future, and fascinating, very detailed information, and recalling, seeing into that. And when you understand that time, what we call time, it's what many spiritual teachers have pointed to is illusion, and that it exists for us to be able, well, we certainly experience it on a linear way of seeing things. So we grow up as a child, we get older, we become a teenager, an adult, and so on and so forth. However, time is existing all at the same time. And so you're able to, and I give this also as an illustration, we're able to, through, like, think of a data center, okay? We all have devices these days. Our devices access information through the web, and that web its origin is a data center somewhere, mostly in the US. If I know, with a lot of Apple devices, they're based in the US, and those data centers store all that information. Now that connects to your individual device. Think of a particular incarnation as a device. And what I call the oversoul is like the data center that stores all of that. Now, I think all of the lives that we've ever lived are stored in the oversoul, and they all connect up to the what we define as the individual soul, or this current incarnation, Mary or Joe or Philip, your physical person. Now, when a person dies, that personality, that entity, that person, that everything that was gained in that individual lifetime isn't lost. It's added to the collective, to the consciousness, to the overall oversoul as learning experience. So nothing is ever lost. So even around the fear of death, even when we have a loved one that's passed over, and I believe you do mediumship work as well.
Yeah, yeah,
You would know this, that they've kept their personality,
yeah.
the quirky things.
Yeah. This leads on to another point that I actually wanted to discuss, actually. So yes, in my experience, whenever somebody comes through to me, now I connect with a lot of celebrities. The very first person really that I had a super strong connection with was Chester Bennington from Linkin Park. And I've talked about that in a few podcasts and things over the years. So I had a very, very strong connection with him, but I get a number of different celebrities that come through to connect. But of course, when you're doing a reading, you get somebody's loved one come through, and you may not know them. You don't know the persona that they had on the earth, but they're able to tell me, they're able to come through and impress upon me, their personality, their temperament, talk to me and tell me a little bit about the characteristics that they had, even about their appearance. And typically what I have found, and I must admit, I haven't found anybody that has retained this, but obviously, whenever we're on the earth, we have different prejudice and things like that shape our view of the world. We might be grumpy. We might, hate darker skinned people. We have all of these different things that shape who we were as a person in that earthly existence. Whenever we cross over, we tend to not bring those things with us.
Yes.
We can retain the personality. And I have even questioned whether the spirit retains the personality whenever they come through, or I'm just receiving an impression of what it was like whenever they were on the earth. But certainly whenever they do connect with me, it's easier with a celebrity because obviously I can relate to what I knew about them in the media. George Michael is another person that I have connected a
Oh,
lot to.
tell
Now
I'm a big
yeah,
fan. I'm a big fan of George Michael, so you're
is
going to have
so
to tell me that one.
he is such an amazing energy. Actually, his energy is amazing, but he comes through actually more. A bit more camp and flamboyant than what I would have thought he
Mm.
was in the earth. You know, his public persona wouldn't have given that away. But his energy is just out of this world. It's
That would
absolutely
make sense,
incredible.
actually. It's synchronistic. I watched a documentary. I think it was BBC. It must be the anniversary of his death, and I watched this the other night. And because back in the 80s and during the time he had fame, he was very heavily repressed
Mm-hmm.
because of his sexuality, and so that would make total sense that he would feel liberated
Yeah,
and probably coming across more authentically. He
yeah.
certainly had he certainly chose a very hard incarnation. Did he learn a lot from that incarnation?
Oh, he learned loads. He
Mm,
learned
good.
loads. And he's just like, even just whenever I talk about people, they automatically just sort of step forward there. And he's just said he's spreading his knowledge and he's showing me sowing knowledge out. So I know that he's still helping people from the other side from where he's at now. But yeah, his energy is just incredible. But whenever I do connect with these people, their personality really comes through. So it's very, very clear that they retain that or we're able to remember that. The prejudices don't. Those
No.
judgments don't. The negative sort of traits don't. They can impress upon me that they had those on the earth, but they don't tend to carry those through. It's like if somebody was a skeptic on the earth, you know, I could be doing a reading for somebody and she'll say, no, my Uncle Dave wouldn't come through because he didn't believe in all of this stuff.
Yeah,
There's no
yeah,
way.
yeah,
But, you know, it's like whenever we crossed over to the other side, if we were a skeptic on the earth, we don't tend to carry that over because by the time we've crossed over, you know, we're fully enlightened and we're aware of the greater consciousness and the bigger picture. What I do find really interesting though, whenever we look at the Nostradamus books, there are situations where he was quite vocal that he didn't want to connect through a woman.
yes.
He didn't
Oh,
value women. So to me that
absolutely.
he's really retained that trait, which just is a very, very different experience to what I have with my mediumship when I'm, and I don't know whether it's because I'm dealing with, I don't know. I can't explain it, I guess. I don't have all of the answers. And hopefully the answers will come. You know, spirit do have a bit of a habit of drip feeding me information as I've
Yeah,
learned one or passed one grade, they'll start to give me information on the
yeah,
next one, which is really
yeah,
good. But at the minute, I don't really have the answer as to why that happens. But I do find that fascinating. The fact that whenever I'm connected with a person of somebody who we perceive has crossed over at this period in time. But yet, whenever we were going back in time to communicate with Nostradamus while he was still on the earth,
yes.
then he still had his prejudices and his
So yeah, because
conceptions.
essentially it was different because she was still communicating with the physical version of not
Right.
the spirit of him that had passed over. And so you're right. He was living at a time in France where women were didn't have the equality that they certainly have now. And so he came with very you would call sexist views, I suppose. But that was his consciousness at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay.
so, and you're right. When someone passes over, those prejudices don't come with them. And so we don't bring any of that because it's essentially our false self, the ego or the egoic mind where all of that programming and conditioning occurs. That's the part of us that dies. The physical body and the egoic self, the higher self or highest self that I call it, retains the lessons and perhaps personality that person has added to the totality of their experience. So they'll take that on and then add it to the totality of what we call the individual soul. But then, you know what, you can get even more complex with this, because then you can say, is there really an individual soul when we're all aspects of the one consciousness? A lot of people like saying that we are all God. I tend to not say that personally. I say we're all a part of God. And the analogy I was given is, think of a human body that has millions or billions of cells in it. We are like a cell in that body of God. So we aren't separate from it. We're intrinsically a part of it. But are we the whole thing from that one cell? Probably not, but we probably have everything within that cell that connects to all other parts. So
Yeah.
illustrations and analogies, I think, are great to help us understand. In fact, a lot of the spiritual teachers over the centuries used parable and illustration to help people understand more convoluted concepts like this.
So whenever we think of QHHT, then in total, like, obviously there's so many different ways that it is used today, and it's brilliant that it has been carried on in the world. But what benefits are there for us to get? Why is it such a great technique?
Healing technique. Yeah, great question. I think for a lot of us, we don't know how to access this internal wisdom that we all have. We don't know how to learn our life purpose, the universal question that most people ask when they come in for a session. And what QHHT does is it's a tool for people to use to help them access everything within them that they don't know how to consciously do. The conscious conditioned mind tends to be very busy most of the time with its what you would call fears and anxieties and conditioning. It's very hard for a lot of people to hear this inner wisdom that's always communicating with them. However, I always say that we need to create an environment, an internal environment that is conducive to hear that voice. QHHT as a form of, as a method rather, is a great way to access that inner wisdom, that inner voice that we call the highest self. And so, like, there are many different doorways into that. Meditation is another wonderful way. And I often find in my work as a practitioner, those that do meditate tend to go a lot deeper and be able to access the information more easily because of being used to silencing the analytical aspect and being able to get in touch with this wisdom. But to answer your question, so much healing can occur, particularly when you point out where a particular problem started with. And this is why we often do past life. We do it at the beginning of QHHT because we often will find that the issue that, or the phobia or the illness that someone is facing can often be Dolores Cannon called it like a bleed over from another incarnation. She called it cell memory. The soul has memory. And for example, if someone received a fatal blow that killed them in one life, that could be, imprinted in this life and be affecting this life. So if someone has drowned in a past life or someone has been hung or something, they could have issues relating to that trauma. And so she called it cell memory.
I find it really fascinating. So I haven't had QHHT. What I have had is I did go to a hypnotherapist once, and it was while I was on my, it's since I've been on my awakening journey. I was just very, very curious about it, and I was more curious to understand how it would differ between what I get with my gifts as they are and what I could gain through hypnosis. However, I found with the hypnosis that I did, it wasn't very, I'm not saying it wasn't very good. I didn't get any more information. It didn't give me any additional information that I couldn't get from just going through and sort of, closing my eyes or sitting and having a conversation with spirit myself and asking them to take me to these different places. Or does that make sense? I don't know if I've
Totally.
articulated
No,
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. You're exactly right. Look, for someone like yourself that is so in touch with your higher self, you're doing this all the time. And so something like hypnosis, the thing that surprises most people about this is how easy it is to access this inner wisdom and inner guidance. And all this is a conscious way of inducing a very natural state that we're all in twice a day. Dolores Cannon called it the somnambulistic state of trance or relaxation. Now, the definition of that is actually sleepwalking, if you look that up. But she was referring to the deepest state of relaxation that we tend to be in twice a day. It's the first moment in the morning when you're just waking up, perhaps to an alarm, but you're still in the dream. And we've all had these experiences. We can be awake. Maybe it's a dog barking. Often that's how I wake up from a dream. I hear my dog, little Louie, barking, and it pulls me out suddenly. But then we can choose to kind of go back into that dream if we want to, if the noise or the dog stops barking. So that's the state that she works with. Now you'll be able to, and you personally will be able to get into that state very naturally because you've created systems for yourself or relaxation techniques that work for you. So I think where this is really beneficial, perhaps for those people that often maybe have an illness in their body and they're getting they're not able to access the reason why.
Mm-hmm.
They're looking for direction. They're looking for life purpose. Um, it's an amazing technique for people to access that if they're stuck in their life. So I think there are people that particularly really benefit from this.
It's super interesting actually because there's so much that I've learned through the Dolores Cannon books and through her work that I have been able to take, snippets of into my work and how I operate. So obviously I haven't been able to completely lift the whole thing, but things like the illnesses carrying over in the cell memory, that has been phenomenal just to be able to have that information and confirmation, I guess, that that exists. So
Yeah.
I had breast cancer,
Okay.
and I actually did this with my guides, and I had sort of asked them to take me back and what had caused it, and could they take me back to the time. And it was actually, I was stabbed in a past life. So, and I was stabbed, I think it was like sort of in the upper chest area. It was on the sort of left hand side, which was the same side that I had cancer. And it's trauma from the wound,
Mm.
in some regard. And I expect that there's probably, other things as well that has contributed to that. But I thought that it was just very, very insightful to be able to get access to that information in a different way to what Dolores talked about, obviously through her work. But it's fascinating to know that there are actually just so many different channels that we can be accessing as people, depending on our ability. And we don't all need to be clairvoyant in order to get access to this information. There are different ways in which we can do it and go about it. And Dolores's technique, I just find phenomenal.
Yeah, great point. I mean, there are so many different ways of accessing this aspect of ourselves, and QHHT is a wonderful doorway for people. But remembering that we're all different, and one method. Look, a lot of people love coming to psychics or mediums, or they come to me for a reading and a healing session one on one, and that's more beneficial for some individuals. So I think it's great to experience as much as you can. I definitely advise it as an experience because I've seen how effective it is for people as.
It's funny because whenever I've worked with spirit, actually, and whenever I'm doing a reading for somebody, whether it's taking them back to a past life or something in their childhood, perhaps, or we're looking into the future, regardless of what we're doing, I get a lot of advice and guidance from my spirit guide. Sometimes it's a different person, but I have a lady that sits with me pretty much constantly, and I might do a reading, and it'll be from start to finish. I'll be with her, and she was my grandmother, actually, which is amazing to have her with me now in this life and to know that, she still sort of exists out there. And, but whenever I bring that information through, and I've maybe taken them back to a past life and given them some information and told them why it's relevant. And I'm often told that they should go and have like a regression themselves to be able to get firsthand experience. So it's definitely something that the spirit realm want for people. They want them to be able to use the available options in order to access this information themselves and have the profound experiences and the connections, and it'll help validate obviously information that they have from other parts of their life, or maybe information that they've been given like from a medium. So for example, I might have given them some information on a past life, and then they're going to go and have a regression and get different information, and then suddenly the dots will all join, or maybe they'll get confirmation of what I have given them, and maybe some. I don't really know exactly what happens whenever these people go off and have their hypnotherapy sessions, but it's just very, very interesting how the two can sort of be alongside each other almost, and like we're working in tandem. It's almost like I could be doing a reading with somebody, and then the next thing you could have them on the couch doing your hypnotherapy and bringing them into that trance, and that's the fascinating thing. It's just, I think there's so much that we don't know about the universe, and a lot of people will say, well, I don't want to say a lot of people. There are people there that will say, but this isn't proven by science. Science can't validate this. Science can't validate that. Psychic gifts don't exist. But also, the science is always changing. And science is only such a small portion. We don't have all the knowledge yet. We can't rely on science to say that, oh, well, if it's not scientifically proven, then it doesn't exist, because science isn't knowledgeable enough, in my opinion, to be able to explain and validate everything that goes on in the universe. And science does sometimes change.
You're absolutely right. And this is why I love the work of the likes of Bruce Lipton and Dr. Joe Dispenza, is they are really using a lot of their own scientific trials to validate a lot of this information, a lot of these ways of connecting, and they're doing a wonderful job of it and getting a lot of credit for it. Now, years ago, even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, things that are now being proven through clinical trials and research were seen as woo-woo even 10, 15 years ago. So we're rapidly understanding science a lot more, but it's so limited because there's only a certain amount of trials that can be done and validated, and then even those concepts can be built upon and further understanding. But you can look at anything in so many different ways. I touched on it earlier with talking about even the way the Bible is interpreted. I can interpret it one particular way and you can the other. It's the same information, same words on a page, and yet we can see it very differently. And I think that's the great thing about getting away from a dogmatic way of thinking and being open. It was Wayne Dyer that said, I was listening to him speak the other day through a recording, And he said, when
I was
you're
going to say that would be very interesting if you were hearing him
yeah,
speak on a
well,
stage.
and I'll say this as well. I do feel his energy around me, believe it or not. And I had some synchronistic things happen recently, and it's really caused me to really want to be under him and learning from him, because I do believe that those that pass over, like the great Wayne Dyer and Dolores Cannon, they continue their work, and people carry that on. But they're very interested in what they left. But Wayne Dyer essentially was saying this. A lot of people, when they're beginning something, they're open to so many different ways of thinking and being, and different concepts and all of this. And then we become experts. We become an expert at something. When you reach that expert level, you've got a very few avenues of possibility, because you've refined and decided and come to conclusions upon things that you have a very narrow view. And so he says, let us all be beginners. Let us remain in that totality of possibility with everything. I think it's a really good concept. So when it comes to spirituality and all of these concepts, I'm open. I'm not rigid or dogmatic about even the way I interpret Dolores Cannon's work. I think it can be expanded upon, and people can come in with different ways of, I try to stay away from being too dogmatic.
Yeah. I think that's a brilliant way to be. And it's certainly something that my mind is open to over the past few years, because I have realized that my truth has changed. What I once thought was my rigid truth and my, well, this is exactly how it is. That really evolved, as I did start to learn and expand my consciousness. And now that I'm much more open, and I'm like, okay, well, this is what I believe today, because this is my experiences. This is what I'm comfortable with. However, I would be open to changing that view and to opening and expanding my mind as I absorb new information. So that's what I always encourage people to, even whenever I've given somebody a reading and I'm saying to them something that really doesn't resonate with them, that's coming for them in the future. And I'll say, but you don't know what path you're on, really. We only have a limited view. So you can't be sure, you cannot be certain of what your beliefs will be in a few years from now, a few months from now, because as you experience things in your life, your mind is going to open up, and you can end up having your belief system absolutely blown apart.
So true. And I've even lived that in my own experience. I grew up as a Christian, and I had a very literalist view of who God was, what God was, and a literal heaven and a literal hell, I once believed was absolutely true. And my consciousness has evolved and expanded, and I've interpreted the Bible differently, and I have a completely different understanding of all of that. So I think we all experience that evolutionary process in all of our lives and our understanding. And what a wonderful thing it is to start out in first grade and to progress through the different grades of life and reach a more advanced stage. And yet, even then, we keep progressing onward, because life is a complete journey. It's never a destination. The moment you're stopping and you're not growing, and in fact, I'm interviewing a 102-year-old person in a couple of weeks' time, and her wisdom for life is to keep growing, always keep learning, keep evolving, because the moment you stop is the moment you are dying. And
That's
you
amazing.
look at it with plants, the moment the plant is no longer growing, or the tree, that tree is in the stages of decay and death. So
Honestly, that's amazing. That would be a very interesting interview with that lady. Very, very interesting interview. Well, honestly, Paul, it has been an absolute pleasure. I'm just very conscious of time, but I am
yeah,
confident that we will have, captured people's ears
yeah,
for the duration. It has been a pleasure
gladly.
having you on
Thank
today.
you for having me. I've enjoyed our chat. It's been great.
It's been absolutely phenomenal. I've really enjoyed it. And you know what? I could sit and talk about this for hours. There is so much to cover with
Yeah. Well,
Dolores's
you
work as
kind of just
well.
scratch the surface, really, when you. I mean, you could talk for many hours about this stuff,
Yeah.
and still not, get beyond the surface. So I'm always learning every day. Every conversation I have, every bit of research I do, I'm always learning, and that's the way to be. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. I completely agree. How can people find you online? How can they connect in with you?
Yeah. Look, the best place with all of my links to TikTok and my YouTube and Instagram and so on is just pwilliamsofficial.com. You'll find all of my links to everything I'm doing, all the platforms I'm on at that link.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you so much. And I will look forward to you receiving lots and lots of interest and new followers from this, because it has been just such an interesting conversation. And yes, many people will come already being aware of Dolores, but I hope that we've planted the seed as well for people that maybe aren't too familiar with her work and are eager to learn a little bit more. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you again.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you're able to, please rate the show or leave feedback on your chosen podcast player. You can also visit the podcast website. Simply head across to thehappypsychic.show, and you can also find me on the socials by searching for @Gemma Lonsdale Guru.